Pardon me?
Let me move around here.
So, okay. Well, I'm going to start because I'm really excited that it was on this day. It was on this date in 1492 that lead pencils were first used. There you go. I'm done. See you later.
Wow.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. Lead pencils, sort of. I don't know, kind of thing. Actually, lead pencils are there's a I don't know what you'd call it, but there's uh, an argument or a meme or a discussion about lead pencils that goes around periodically. And it's based on a business writer, a while back pointed out that nobody knows how to make a lead pencil. You know, there is nobody anywhere who can walk into his or her garage and make a lead pencil, like the number 2 pencil. He's going on to all of the different people involved in the making of a lead pencil. And it has to do with how knowledge is transmitted nowadays. That you have to have somebody that can pick the tree. You have to have somebody who can find the right type of tree, that they cut it down in the right way, get it to the right place, and then you have to cut it. And then you have to have somebody who can cut it the right way, and then you have to have somebody who can shape the pencil the right way, and then you have to have somebody who can get the graphite for the pencil and shape the pencil, and you have to figure out how to get the graphite into the pencil, kind of thing, in a way with the type of wood and the direction and all of the different pieces, all of the different persons that are involved in the creation of a lead pencil, or what we call it, number 2 pencil. It hasn't been a lead pencil for quite some time. But on this date in 1751, Philip Doddridge died. Philip Doddridge, who wrote the book The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul. And he's significant because he's the guy that led William Wilberforce to the Lord. And so William Wilberforce went on to become a leader, a politician, member of parliament, and was instrumental in ending the slave trade in England. You've seen there's other. Oh, just in time. I was going to skip the what happened on this day, but since you're here, see, in 1834, the first Episcopal parish in Chicago was founded. In 1834, it was actually the first brick church in Chicago. I just say that because we're having issues with the bricks on our church. It's like, well, if we hadn't done bricks, we wouldn't be having these problems. But it's now referred to as St. James Cathedral. It's still there. It's still around. And interestingly, the founding group of this parish included the grandmother of Juliet Gordon Low, who some of you may remember as being the founder of the Girl Scouts. Her grandmother was instrumental in the founding of this particular church. In 1881, today is the day of the gunfight at the OK Corral. So it did happen. It was a real thing. The movies make it look a lot more interesting than it actually was, but it did take place on this date. With Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and all those guys. That was on this date. In 1892, Ida B. Wells published Southern Horrors: Lynch Law in All Its Phases. Ida B. Wells was a Chicagoan, African-American woman who became a rather prolific author, and was a leader of what we would call women's liberation, but Black women's liberation as well. And my favorite story about Ida B. Wells, is that there was going to be a big suffragette march in Washington in like 1916 or something like that, and 1915, somewhere in that time period. And so she got a group of Black women from Chicago to march and went to Washington, D.C. for the march. And she was told that, and there were going to be the state processions. Okay, so it was going to be, Iowa, Illinois. I guess it would be Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, whatever. But then she was told that they didn't want to have Black women in the group. They wanted it just to be white women, and the Black women could walk at the end. of it. So she put up some resistance, and then she said, okay, fine. Well, then we just won't march. And so she and the black women that were with her just went and stood on the side of the parade, and as the parade started, and when the Illinois delegation went by, they just walked out and went along with the group. But now, the road that used to be Congress Parkway is now called Ida B. Wells Drive. So she's one of the great Chicagoans. I don't know if he was a Chicagoan, but today is the day that R.A. Torrey died. R.A. Torrey. Okay, remember we talked about James Gray earlier, being an early superintendent. R.A. Torrey, also as in Torrey Gray Auditorium. So he was the first superintendent of the Moody Bible Institute. And last, it may not matter to any of you, but it was on this date in 1970 that Doonesbury debuted, the cartoon Doonesbury, which I still follow. All right, so we've been talking about David, right? That's where, right? We've been talking about the book of Samuel, and we started. So I'm going to review all 55 chapters that we've covered here. So first we had Hannah. Remember, it all started with a barren woman. That was my first, and I know that because that was the title of the first handout. Because in my searching around for stuff, I go, hey, that's the first handout. So yeah, it all started with a barren woman, Hannah, and then Hannah has Samuel. Samuel becomes the priest, the high priest, the judge, prophet. Then he anoints Saul. Saul becomes the king. Saul's has everything going for him, yet he's not able to pull it off. And so David then is anointed king. And David, unlike Saul, is granted a covenant, the Davidic covenant, where God tells David that your throne will be on, your family will be on the throne forever. Okay, this eternal covenant. That's important. That comes back. We'll come back later. And then we see the life of David, both good and bad, highlights, lowlights, things he does, things that he shouldn't have done. And it's a very, and I find it interesting. It's the more you get into it, the more problematic David's life is. I mean, there's a lot of things, we all know about Bathsheba. Everybody knows, we know two stories. We know Bathsheba, we know David and Goliath. But you get all the rest of these things in there, and it gets a little weird. And next week we'll talk about another weird story with David and the famine, or the plague, I should say. But most of the story ends around chapter 21. All right, well, let me see, where did it end? With the revolt of Sheba, and chapter 20. And then we have this epilogue at the end, this kind of stuck-on piece that, it's kind of hard to picture. You say, okay, so somebody had this book and had this whole narrative about David, and then they said, you know what, there's a couple of other things, sort of like an appendix. Kind of like, okay, there's a couple of other things I want you to know about David, a couple of other events that you should know about David. And so they're not necessarily in order. And we'll see that. In fact, it makes a lot more sense, this last 6 chapters, if you say this isn't in chronological order. Now, you can argue that it is, and that's fine. It's just, if you do, then you got, okay, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? All right. So once you accept the fact that, again, when they were writing history back in the day, whenever this was actually put to paper, they weren't writing it with the same concepts or principles or approaches that we would write history today. All right, so it was, so it's easier to say, okay, this happened, interspersed, but there's a couple of other stories you need to know. It's kind of like you read a whole story about somebody and you just happen to know an anecdote about that person, and somebody says, oh yeah, I know, let me tell you something else he did. That's kind of what this last thing is. And we know because these last 3 or 4 chapters have this, what we call the chiastic structure. Okay. And so, well, previously we learned that this is part of an epilogue. This story is part of an epilogue to Samuel, and it has a chiastic structure. And a chiastic structure is a way that it's you have a point, a second point, third point, and then they start balancing off of each other. Okay, and again, we had I've only got pink, light green. So you'll have the A point, the B point, the C point, and then the B prime and the A prime, and these will kind of balance out in a way. So there'll be a story of a battle, there'll be a story of a battle, there'll be a story of a conversation, there'll be a story of a conversation, and then there'll be the Lord makes an appearance. Okay, I'm sort of making this up. This is not how this chapter goes. And the point of a chiastic structure is the centerpiece. That's when you understand a chiastic structure, then you start saying, okay, what's the center? Because that's what they're leading up to and coming away from. All right, and I did a series once in another church in a past life. Um, it was called the Book a Day Bible Study. I called it. So there were about 50 sessions, and every session we did a book of the Bible. So it was like an introduction to every book of the Bible. And one of the books that I used for that was a book called the Literary Guide to the Old Testament, or something like that. And this author had gone through every Old Testament book, from Habakkuk to Psalms to Genesis, and identified the chiastic structure within the book, and we could say, okay, this is why this. And it's kind of interesting when you do that, and you start asking yourself, you're reading through books like Genesis or whatever, and you see this is an odd place to put this story. Sometimes you ever thought about that? And then when you understand the chiastic structure, it's there to balance off the other side, kind of thing. So I said all that to say this chiastic structure, this epilogue, it centers on these two poems. And last week we talked about, or last month, was it last month? Yeah, it was last month. We talked about David's Song of Praise, which was also the same as Psalm 18. And now we're getting into what is often referred to as David's last words. That's what my Bible labels it as. Of course, the verse 4 says, these are the last words of David. Okay. But the chiastic structure puts this poem at its center. Well, these two poems, I should have said, at its center. So this is the epilogue, is for these two stories to be, or these two poems to be in here. It also brackets, interestingly, with Hannah's poem at the start of the story. It's the start of David. So you have Hannah. If you remember, Hannah comes in, and then Eli says, okay, you're going to get what you want. And she gives this great poem of praise. And now you have this poem of praise from David at the end of the story as well. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on in Hebrew in the Old Testament. That there's a lot more. We tend to read it. We tend to read we tend to read the Bible when we do read it, like we read any other book. Just, okay, it's always start to finish, left to right, and it's not necessarily that way. Sometimes there's a structure to it that, if you don't necessarily have to know the structure to get something out of the passage, but knowing that makes you kind of understand better what the writer is trying to do. Yes.
Stan, is the chiastic structure something more unique to Hebrew literature, or do you see that in other literature styles also?
I don't know. The question is no, it's in other literature, because there's a word for it, there's a diagram, there's an explanation of how you can do it, and you can write a story now using a chiastic structure. Chiastic structure. What's the singular word? Chiasma. That's how I'm pronouncing it. It could be chiasma, I suppose, but it's key. Yeah, it's a key. Okay, Debbie's going. It's a key. Okay, it's a hard K sound. So there are other. You can write it. You can do it now. So getting into the passage itself, David's what are called David's last words. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there are three motifs. This is what the commentary called them. Three motifs in this first set of words. MOTIFS. Motifs or themes. Kind of three ideas that come in this final poem. The first one is God's sovereignty. We talk about God's sovereignty. We talk about God's moral expectations and God's abiding fidelity. Okay, and that's where we're going to get into talking about that eternal covenant again. So you have God's sovereignty, God's moral expectations and God's abiding fidelity. Now the text starts off with, these are the last words of David. Okay, well, are they? I mean, is this the last thing that David said? I mean, we can look at this and say, okay, David said this. He gets to the end of where they lie, and then the rest is silence. That's the end of Hamlet, right? Right, and he dies. Okay, so that could be how it went. It's probably not. It's more. It's not that these are the last things that David said. It's that this is the last thing we're going to say of David, or that we're going to record in this book. David's last words in this book, kind of thing. Or although it's really not. So it's kind of like, what was David's final oracle? Okay, so again, and an oracle is, and this is an interesting way. The passage goes on. It says, the inspired utterance of David, son of Jesse. Okay, now the NIV is unique in translating the word that way. Most other translations say something along the line of the sayings of David or the oracle of David. And when you talk about an oracle, because that's kind of what the Hebrew word is, an oracle is a message from the gods. And so, well, if it's an oracle, then it's inspired from God, kind of thing. And so, but the NIV has said, well, let's just call it the inspired utterance of David. So it's like, so this may be the last oracle of David. This is the last message David gives to people, or his last address, like Washington's last address kind of thing. And every time a president leaves office, there's always a final address sort of stuff. And so it's his final words in that sense. Okay. Now, again, I don't think it's like the last words that David ever said. This is not a deathbed confession. I mean, unless David was like a really, really super, super, super talented guy that could sit down and write a nice 6-word poem while, on the verge of the, the Grim Reapers at the edge of the bed. Come on, let's go. Come on, I don't think. I don't think it happened like that. So what is David? What are David's last words? Okay, so he says, the inspired utterance of David, son of Jesse, the utterance of the man exalted by the Most High. Okay, the man anointed by the God of Jacob, the hero of Israel's songs. Okay, now again, the NIV has just an interesting way they're translating this first verse. Okay, so we talk about God's sovereignty. Okay, so why is David where he is? Well, because God exalted him. So he's giving God the credit. Okay, God is the one to put me here. Okay, and we know that if we went through the book, we remember David and Samuel getting anointed and all of that. So the utterance of the man exalted by the Most High, the man anointed by the God of Jacob. Now, it's interesting that he talks about the God of Jacob. Why Jacob? Why not the God of Abraham? Why not the God of Joseph? Why the God of Jacob? Well, one idea, and again, we don't really know. I mean, it could have been fit the rhythm better, but it's who is Jacob? Well, Jacob was also named Israel. So Jacob is the founder that is kind of given credit as being the progenitor of the nation. So when we think of the nation of Israel, it's the nation of Jacob. Okay, so the same God who created the nation also created the ruling family. So it puts those two together that, okay, we are bound together forever. We are never going to part, kind of thing. So God exalted, God created Jacob, God created Israel, God created the Davidic family for ruling here. So the man anointed by God, the hero of Israel's songs. Okay, most other translations tend to say that he's the singer of or the sweet singer of other songs. And so again, this is one of those questions where, when you look at a translator, who has a different translation other than an NIV? What does it say?
Israel's beloved singer of songs.
Israel's beloved singer of songs.
Yeah. In the ESV it says, and the sweet psalmist of Israel.
The sweet psalmist of Israel. Okay, so again, that's a different meaning. Okay, the sweet psalmist of Israel, or the singer or the hero of the songs. I mean, that's like three different ideas. And the problem here is that the phrase itself that's used there is not used anywhere else in the Old Testament. And so anytime you have a translation, okay, so if you were only an NIV person, or if you were only a New American Standard, or if you were only the Net Bible, that was the only Bible you ever used, and said, "Oh, this is it." You say, "Wait a minute, somebody made an interpretive decision there." So there's a lot of interpretive decisions that go into whatever text you have. Yes.
First verse of 2 Samuel 23.
Yes.
I had the sweetness of the songs of Israel.
The sweetness of the songs of Israel. Okay, so there's four. They don't all. They're not all four like exactly the same thing. Okay, but we know there's a connection between David. There's a connection between the songs of Israel, and one of the things we know well, David was certainly responsible for many psalms, and we know earlier that David was a poet, and so here you have this. Okay, so now the translators are looking at that and they're going, okay, well, what is it trying to say? What is it? What is the message that the writer is trying to get across? And see, I don't like the hero of Israel songs. I don't like that translation, simply because here on the one hand he's giving God the credit, and then he said, "And I'm the hero." That's why I don't, and I can sit there and say I don't know that I really like that particular. It's fine. I mean, I'm not gonna throw my NIV away because of it, but it's just one of those things where the NIV just to me made an odd translation decision. And it makes more sense based on what I know about David to just call him the singer, the sweet singer of the songs. Although he is the hero of a lot of the stories. So the Spirit of the Lord. So this is talking about God's sovereignty. The Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. His word was on my tongue. Okay, so the Spirit, the God of Israel spoke. The Rock of Israel said to me. Okay, so here he's talking about the Spirit is talking through me. This would be one of the verses if you were creating a doctrine of inspiration or inerrancy and say, how does God communicate with us? How did God communicate? Here David is just telling you, well, the Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. Okay, and he also, the Rock of Israel spoke to me here. I'm going to go back here. So the inspired utterances has many other translations there. And then the Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. Okay, just talking about the inspiration of it. So again, David is giving God the credit. Okay, God exalted him. If you like my poetry, if you like my psalms, it isn't because I'm necessarily talented. It's because God spoke through me. Okay, so another reason why do we feel that the Old Testament is valid? There is a kind of a movement nowadays. We can't remember what it was. Detach was the word used. Very well-known preachers got up and said, "Oh, we need to detach from the Old Testament." It's like, well, this is the Spirit of the Lord speaking through me. He's talking about the Psalms. He's talking about his writings. So the God of Israel spoke, the Rock of Israel said to me. Now, this is a message that David is giving to, or that God is giving to David. He says, when one rules over people in righteousness, when he rules in the fear of God. Okay, so this is kind of like an if-then. So an if-then statement. If this, then that. Okay, if you rule in righteousness, then he is like the light of morning at sunrise on a cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings grass from the earth. Okay, this whole idea now, Jesus is going to come back later and say, I am the what of the world? The light of the world. Okay, so here it kind of introduces this idea of if you're ruling in righteousness, you're going to see the light, which means the people around you aren't necessarily going to be righteous. Okay, because if you have a flashlight doesn't do a lot of good in a very bright room, right? So if I had a flashlight here, it wouldn't it wouldn't do anything. You'd just be like, why do you have a flashlight with the lights on? Right. So, when it calls out how much light you're going to be, suggests that around you is going to be dark, that you are going to be a witness. Then again, you can go there. The New Testament develops this idea quite a bit, a shining city on a hill and all that kind of stuff. When one rules over people in righteousness, when he rules in the fear of God, he is like light of morning at sunrise on a cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings grass from the earth. Okay, ruling in righteousness is like that moment, and we all know that moment. It's been raining on a summer day, and then it stops, and the sun breaks through, and you go outside, and oh, it's beautiful out here now. Wet, you can't sit down anywhere because it's all wet, but it's still beautiful out here. Okay, and then and so there he's talking about God's moral expectations. This is the second motif here. Okay, God's moral expectations. If you rule in righteousness, you're going to be like light. Now the question here is when did David write this? I mean, or to what extent did David follow this? Okay, and I think there was certainly a point in time where David could say, "Yeah, I'm light," and he was the light. But it got a little cloudy there, if you know what I mean. Okay, especially near after 2 Samuel 11. But then he comes into God's abiding fidelity, and this is let's see, inspired utterance. The Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. So verse 3 has a message sent to David. So the first we talked about the Lord spoke through me, and then he gives the message to David. If you rule in righteousness, you, David, will be like light. And I think you could draw the conclusion that if our life is a life of righteousness, then we would be like light as well. And then the same thing that if you are in a dark room and somebody turns on a light, that's so everybody turns, ooh, it stands out. The person with the light stands out, kind of thing. We're having issues in the school right now. Not issues, but there's two teachers who like to teach with the lights off. This is not an unusual thing. I mean, people and so the one teacher comes to me and says, "Do you know this other one teacher?" Two different teachers have come to me and said, "Hey, do you know this guy in this room doesn't have his lights on?" Yeah, I know that. I'm well aware. Well, I don't think that's a good thing. Like, well, okay. So what's your point? what do you want me to do here? And they want me to go in there. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that, because I've been in rooms where, classrooms where they took like flannel pillowcases that were cloud colored, like light blue with clouds on them, and like cut them over. Not here. This was at Boulder Kai. Cut them and covered all of the light covers with them, so that when you turn the light on, it's very muted. And if anybody looks up, I guess they're supposed to look up and think they're outside. I don't know. You can see here. You see these lights here, right? When do they go on? Okay, well, you turn the lights off and then you turn those on, kind of thing. So there's a lot of different alternative people. And again, part of it has to do with, the class. This has nothing to do with David, just so you know. It is going to be on your test, but there's a lot of different ways that, or it gives the students a sense of control over their environment, is the other, but these particular rooms both have big, huge windows in them. So both of these teachers, I'm like, no, I'm not. That's, if you want to convince them to turn the lights on, go ahead, but I'm not going to. I mean, I talked about it with them long before. I mean, I knew right away, immediately, hey, you don't have the lights on, But be that as it may, if our life in the world of darkness is one of righteousness, we will be light. Okay, there. So then he says, talking about God's abiding fidelity. Verse 5 here, chapter 23, verse 5. Again, we had an if-then statement before. Now he's going to do a negated if-then statement. Okay, and a negated in if-then statement is called a contrapositive. That's your logic lesson for the day. Okay, it's called a contrapositive. So it's an if-then statement. If you're hungry, you eat, then it's time to eat. Okay, a negated one, if you're not hungry, then it's not time to eat, or then you should not be eating. Okay, so that's kind of a negated. Okay, if you're hungry, you should eat. If you're not hungry, you should not eat. So the latter is a contrapositive. Okay, And so that's what he does. So he's creating a contrapositive here. And the interesting thing is we can ask how accurate it is. If my house were not right with God, okay, so that's the if part. If my house were not right with God, surely he would not have made with me an everlasting covenant, arranged and secured in every part. Okay, so if my house were not right with God, then God would not have secured the covenant. Now, if that's true, and you can prove that you've got the covenant, then it stands to reason that the house, it is logically true that his house must be right with God. Okay, um, so this is David's statement. Okay, now, was David's house right with God? Well, there were several points of time where it was. Clearly, when David was called, David's house was right with God. When David was on the run, David's house was right with God. But beginning with 2 Samuel 11, there's a lot of different ways to describe David's family, but being right with God is not one of them. Okay, you got all kinds of stuff going on. But perhaps by the time when he came back after the revolt of Sheba, at that point, okay, I got it. Okay, the house is right with God. But this was part of the thing about the eternal covenant, and this eternal covenant. Why does God choose David for this eternal covenant? I mean, was he a great king? Is he the best king that Israel ever had? Okay, now some people would argue that he is. Okay, I don't think so. He was not. To me, Josiah is a much better king. We go through the Old Testament than what we read about him. Okay, I mean, David's a fine king. He's the exemplar. He's still, people talk about King David. There's a King David Hotel. There's a King David this. There's a King David that in Israel. But God chose him because God chose him. That's it. Why did God choose Abraham? Because he did. Why? I don't know. Okay. Why did God choose you and me? I don't know. If you were God, would you have chosen you? Okay. If I were God, I'll tell you, here's who I would have chosen it. I'm just kidding. Not going to do that. Not going to do that. Okay. Why? Why did God choose David? Because he did. Because in his sovereignty, David, you're the one, kind of thing. Why did God choose Abraham? Okay. Who was an idol worshiper? We find in Hebrews that Abram in Genesis was not a righteous man following the God of Adam at that point. Abraham would not have walked around and said, "Oh, the God of Abraham, the God of Adam." He was an idol worshiper. Why did God choose him? Because he did. Okay. But it's interesting. I mean, David's like, well, so my house, surely he wouldn't have done it if my house weren't right with God. So I disagree with David here. Okay, I don't. David's choice of being the having that Davidic covenant, which leads into why Christ is who he is, king, prophet, priest, all that. So there is that piece going forward. But he's talking about this covenant arranged and secured in every part. And we know based on the later verses that he did that, or through the whole story. Continuing on here, he says, "Surely he would not bring to fruition my salvation and grant me my every desire." Okay. Now I don't think he's talking about in the spiritual sense. I think he's talking about salvation. I mean, he could be, but I think he's talking about salvation in the he saved me from Saul. He saved me from this. So it's like so the word itself doesn't require a spiritual. Oh, this is I became a believer at this point, kind of thing, and grant my every desire. Okay. But evil men are all to be cast aside like thorns, which are not gathered with the hand. Okay. Whoever touches thorns uses a tool of iron or the shaft of a spear. They are burned up where they lie. It's kind of interesting here. We talk again. There's some things that are we talk about being underdeveloped in the idea of hell is not developed very well in the Old Testament. Okay, the idea of heaven is not developed very well in the Old Testament. Okay, it doesn't mean it's not there. And here's an indication of future judgment. Evil men are going to be cast up like thorns. What do you do with thorns? You burn them. Okay, so it's like this is what's going to happen to evil men. Okay, and this is part of God's sovereignty. Okay, so verse 5 here, David makes a negated if-then argument, a contrapositive. If my house, family, were not righteous, then God would not have made an eternal covenant with me. Okay, so the positive, if my house is righteous, God will make an eternal covenant with me. Okay, well, I think God made the eternal covenant with David because God wanted to make the eternal covenant with David. Okay, it was not something David earned. Okay, so just like our salvation is not something that David earned. But I believe at the time, certainly by the end of his life, I think David could say, my house is righteous. We're not right with God, kind of thing. But he closed it, so it kind of dates the poem. So it's what that means is it's not written before 2 Samuel 7. 2 Samuel 7, that's where the Davidic covenant comes in, where God tells David, you will be king. Your family will be the king forever, sort of. So it had to come after that. Okay, so this poem, whenever it was written when David was king, not before. Okay. Then he closes with this judgment on evil men. Okay, this judgment on evil men, not unlike Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7 is where people come to me and say, Lord, Lord, did we not do fabulous things? Which to me is like the scariest verse in the Bible, if you really think about it. You know, I've got nothing. I mean, again, this is only okay. This is more closely related to what we're talking about than putting pillowcases on windows, but on lights. But yeah, I mean, think about it. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter in the kingdom of heaven. I mean, that, you know, maybe that should be the church's mission statement. Not everyone who says, no, don't. I didn't say that. I'm gonna have to delete this off the video, kind of thing. But it's you know, so it's like there are people in our church that are church. I mean, big church, capital C, church, that are out there thinking they're doing a work of some sort, and when push comes to shove, you know, it's going to be no, sorry. I don't think God's going to say sorry. I think he's just going to say no, you know, kind of thing. But all right, any questions on that? Because we switch gears a little bit here, and we start talking about David's mighty men. Okay, David's mighty men. Now, here's what it is. So there's the mighty men are in two groups. There's a group of 3, and there's a group that's called the 3, and there's a group of 30 that's called the 30. Okay. Now, the catch is, of the 3, these are the 3 greatest, except there's one that's greater than the 3, but not part of the 3. And then in the 30, there's like 37 names that are included in the 30. Okay. So again, this is a name for the group. Okay. It isn't that there had to be 30 people in there. Okay, so I mean, let's not get too caught up with, okay, well, this one really isn't. All right, and so you're going to talk about the 3, and then we're going to talk about a little event, and then we're going to talk about the 30. Okay, briefly. I'm not going to kind of read through all of these. So the second part deals with David's mighty men. There's a group of 3 and a group of 30. Okay, so the 3, talk about the 3 first of all. These are the names of David's mighty warriors. Josheb-Basshebeth, a Tekomanite, was chief of the 3. He raised a spear against 800 men whom he killed in one encounter. Okay, that's a lot of people. Okay, so how long that encounter took, I don't know. I got to believe it takes some time to kill 800 people. How he did it, we don't know. But one of the common things you'll see with these guys is they did something single-handedly. Okay, so the first one is this guy Josheb-Basshebeth. Okay, killed 8. Next to him was Eleazar, son of Dodai the Ahohite, as one of the 3 mighty warriors. He was with David when they taunted the Philistines, gathered at Pas-Dammim for battle. Okay, now there's no record of this battle in any other canonical source. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. There were a lot of battles that took place. Okay. He was with David. So then the Israelites retreated. So there's this battle going on. You kind of get the idea. So Eliezer is there with David. They're fighting. Then everybody retreats except for Eliezer. Okay, but Eliezer stood his ground and struck down the Philistines till his hand grew tired and froze to the sword. It's kind of like if you've ever done something and you've held on to something for so long, you just, when you're in a situation like that, when it's you against another army, you don't have a whole lot of choices. Hey, can we set this down? Let me, scratch my hand a bit. You just, hold on, time out, it doesn't work, right? He's there so long that he couldn't take his hand away from the sword, but he held the day. Okay. This troops returned to Eliezer, but only to strip the dead. By the time they got back, the only thing the rest of the troops had to do was to go out and, go over the Philistines that were lying there and see if there was anything worth looting, which was basically at that time, that was one of the ways that soldiers got paid. So the Lord brought a great victory that day. The troops returned to Eliezer, but only to strip the dead. Next to him, so this is the third one. Next to him was Shammah, son of Agi the Hararite. When the Philistines banded together at a place where there was a field full of lentils, Israel's troops fled from them. But Shammah took his stand in the middle of the field. So again, same thing as Eliezer. So these mighty men, one of the things they have in common is that, or at least the last two, is that they were in a fight. Everyone else deserted. They stayed there and fought. He defended it and struck the Philistines down, and the Lord brought about a great victory. Okay.
So I got a question.
Yes.
All right. So like with the first mighty man, Joshua being the Hakamonite,
Mm-hmm.
and then the other ones, are they like? Is that like the town they're from in Israel, or are they foreigners, or what?
It's a both and. It's there are several people in here who are not Israelites, although the majority of the people listed here are from Judah. So it's some of them. In some of them, they're cities where, and I just chose not to get in. Some of they're from cities they don't know where the city is. It just says this was a city that was around at that time. So there are foreigners in the list. I couldn't tell you whether Takamon was a city. Does it say? Well, I don't have a study Bible, but so now we have this little story, which is an interesting story to me. So now we're just kind of in the middle of this whole list of mighty men. We're going to get an example of just how crazy these guys are. Okay. So next to him, verse 13. During harvest time, 3 of the 30 chief warriors came down to David at the cave of Adullam, while a band of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. Okay. Now, so this just says there's 3 of the 30. And again, this is a little bit of confusion because it's like, okay, we just talked about 3 guys, 3 mighty men, and now we're going to talk about the 30. So is this an introduction to the 30 and say 3 of these guys, or are these 3 the 3 just referred to? Okay, we don't know. Could be either. Okay, I think it's the 3 of the 30, but be that as it may. So David's in this battle. He's got his 30 mighty men around him, 30-ish mighty men around him. Okay. And they're besieged, basically. Okay. He says, at that time, David was in the stronghold, and the Philistine garrison was at Bethlehem. Okay, so they're fighting the Philistines. So this event takes place probably before David is fully ensconced as king. Okay, because again, they're still fighting the Philistines, and they didn't fight the Philistines much once David became king. He kind of settled that whole Philistine question. So again, this is an example of, this is just a story put in here to kind of illustrate just what kind of guys David was hanging with. Okay, so David there says, oh, that someone would get me a drink. David longed for water and said, oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem. Okay, oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the gate. So there's something about either, it could be that they didn't have any water where they were. I doubt that's the problem. It was just something about this, or maybe it was just the thought of having water from his hometown was what he was just thinking about. You know, he's in a philosophical mood, or he's in a melancholy mood. Oh, if somebody would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem. Okay, so 3 of these guys say, all right, king wants a glass of water, let's go get him a glass of water. So they have to break out of whatever besieged, out of the cave, through the camp of the other, you know, the Philistines that they're fighting. They got to get through that. They get through that, then they get to Bethlehem. They have to get through the Philistine guard there to get to the well. And if you think about it, wells are usually in public places. So somehow or other, they had to make it so they could get to this well and reach in and grab water. Now they've got to do the reverse while holding water. Okay, in whatever they were holding it in, they could not lose the water. All right, okay, and they do that. So the 3 mighty warriors broke through the Philistine lines, drew water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem, and carried it back to David. Okay, now really, this is like just an insane story. Like, seriously, you know, David didn't ask them to do it. He's just, you know, opining. He's just wishing he had a glass of water. Now, sometimes this kind of stuff works. I mean, Debbie does this stuff all the time. She just sits there, oh, that somebody would get me a can of sparkling water from the refrigerator. And next thing you know, poof, she's got a can of sparkling water. So she has that kind of power, I'm just saying. But, you know, there's a story, you know, there's a story in history about Henry II, King of England, and Thomas Becket, who was martyred. That Thomas Becket had been friends with Henry. They'd been drinking buddies, literally. And then Thomas Becket becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury and suddenly goes on the straight and narrow. And Henry II doesn't like it, and so now they're clashing between them two. And the story is, I don't know how true this is, I don't know, but the story allegedly is that Henry II is talking to a group of people, and he says something to the effect of, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Well, guess what? A couple of guys standing there go, "Hey, king wants us to get rid of a priest. Let's go get rid of a priest." And if you go to Canterbury today, you can go and you can see the door where they broke in, and you can see the spot where this is where they killed Thomas of Becket. Okay, and they did it. Okay, now of course that blew back on Henry II because, you know, it didn't end well. You know, there was some issues about that, but the same idea. Okay, was Henry II asking somebody to kill him? You know, Thomas said no, or I'm sorry, Henry II said no, it wasn't, but, you know, nobody believed him. But nobody, I don't think anybody still believes him. So here, David is like, oh, would somebody get me this glass of water? All right. So it's an absolutely insane thing to do. Okay. I mean, it shows this just how loyal these guys were. All right. I mean, these guys are not just great warriors. These guys are super loyal to just the nth, yeah, to the nth degree. They are. And then the odd thing about this story, and they brought this water back to David, and David realizes what's happened. Okay, these 3 guys have sacrificed their life, their very life, so that I can have a drink of water. Okay. And then David doesn't drink the water. Okay, I don't have an explanation for this. Okay, I don't. I tried to find, okay, you know, and it says, but he refused to drink it. Instead, he poured it out before the Lord. Far be it from me, Lord, to do this. Is it not the blood of men who went at the risk of their lives? And David would not drink it. You know, I mean, perhaps he thought, wow, I can't, you know, this was too great a sacrifice. This is too valuable a gift to me, you know. So again, I don't have an explanation on why David doesn't drink the water, or if it's too great a gift, give it to somebody else to drink. Why pour it out on the ground? I mean, I get the whole pour it out offering, and that's one of the types of offerings. Okay, but it's not a sacrifice on David's part. David did nothing for this. The 3 guys were the ones that sacrificed, you know, not David. So if David's pouring it out as a sacrifice, he's not the one sacrificing. the three guys are. Now, some have looked at this and said, well, this is kind of like what the woman Mary in the Gospels, who breaks the jar of expensive oil and just pours and wastes it. Isn't that what Judas says? You're wasting it. You know, it's a tenuous link. I'm sorry. Yes.
My thought is, if I was one of those guys and I saw him pour it on the ground, like, you better savor and love that water. Like,
Right.
like,
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I'm like, if I had gone to all of that trouble and you just poured it out, you know, on the ground. I mean, you know, maybe you've had an experience. Of course, it's never happened to me where I've given a gift to someone, and the you think the gift is great. You think, oh, I have nailed it, right? I nailed this one, and you give it to the person. Again, this has never happened to me, and the person goes, oh, thanks. And you're like, wait, no, that was the perfect gift right there. Okay, and then it's like, you know, that kind of it could ruin your Christmas. I wouldn't know because it has never ever happened to me.
It happened in our family. Well, I'll just share a quick story here. My son was about 4 or 5 years old, and my mother gave him a gift for Christmas, and she decorated really cutely. She was really good at decorating gifts, and then she had like a couple little toys on the outside the package, and so he could not wait to open it. So he's tearing through it, and then it's like clothes. And he's like, and we have this, like, I think got a picture. He's like, oh, and then he just threw it over his shoulder. And that's been like a really big family story.
There you go. There you go.
I didn't appreciate that gift.
Yes. It's never and so yeah. I don't. It's you know. I think the point of the story is to just show how insanely loyal and talented in weird ways these guys were. Okay, not necessarily what David did with the water. Well, to me, it's like, okay, why? I don't know. There isn't really a good explanation. That something about it. You know, I can understand his not wanting to take the water. It's the pouring out that's the part that I can't explain. I don't know what. I'm sorry. Did you have some?
we weren't all looking at Debbie as Sam or Sam, right?
No. I said it has never. I have never. Yeah. So, but be that as it may. So that's that. So this is just kind of stuck in the middle there. Just sort of, hey, here's how crazy these guys are. Okay, in a good way. You know, I mean, these are the kind of guys that you want on your side. Okay. So, and then we go through. David refuses to drink the water, pouring it. Some see a link between this and John 12. That is where Mary breaks the jar again. I don't. It may be kind of it's a stretch, but there it is. Such were the exploits of the three mighty warriors. So again, the point of the story is what the three mighty warriors are doing, not necessarily what David is doing. So we can't look at this and say that when somebody brings us a gift, we can just pour it on the ground and use that. If you know, like if your spouse gets you, a membership at a gym, a health club for Christmas, kind of thing. That doesn't mean you can just pour it on the ground. Or husbands, if you buy your wife for her birthday a vacuum cleaner or something like that, that's not a.
There's a lot of hidden meaning behind it.
Yeah. You can't. That's not a. I did. What was it? I got you something one time that I made a big. It might have been like a vacuum cleaner. Oh yeah, right. So I bought her. I made a big noise. I think a Facebook post about it that I bought my wife a mop for Christmas, and she was happy with it. And I lived to tell the story. But it was one of these electronic ones that you plug in and it just mops the floor for you while you just leave it, kind of thing. So it is possible to give kitchen appliances, that kind of stuff. But yeah, so don't go buying like how to make your husband's lunch books. Kind of, that's not. Especially if you've been married for 35 years. It's too late. She does an excellent job doing lunch, by the way. I'm just saying. So continuing on, now it's just kind of a list of the group of men that are following David. So above but not a part of the three is Abishai. And we remember Abishai. Abishai has been around through the story, and we find out that Abishai is one of these 30. Okay. Abishai, the brother of Joab, son of Zeruiah, was chief of the three. He raised his spear against 300 men, whom he killed, and so he became as famous as the three. Was he not held in greater honor than the three? He became their commander, even though he was not included among them. So again, doesn't that mean there are four? But it's, no, there are three. So maybe it's like, the Three Musketeers, there's actually four of them, kind of thing. Athos, Porthos, Aramis, and then D'Artagnan, kind of, Did you all know that as far as the Three Musketeers go, there are actually 5 novels about the Musketeers? There's five novels. So they're called the D'Artagnan series. So the Three Musketeers is the first one, and the Man in the Iron Mask is the last one. And there's 3 others in between, kind of thing. That's free. That won't be on your test. And we just start listing some of these men here. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, a valiant fighter from Kabzeel, performed great exploits. He struck down Moab's 2 mightiest warriors. He also went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. Okay, it's Tuesday. Where's Benaiah? Oh, he's in the pit killing. I don't what that story is. I don't know. But he goes down there and kills a lion. And he struck down a huge Egyptian. Although the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, Benaiah went up against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. Such were the exploits of Benaiah, son of Jehoiada. He too was as famous as the 3 mighty warriors. But he wasn't part of the 3. He was part of the 30. He was held in greater honor than any of the 30, but he was not included among the 3. Are you getting this straight? Okay, this is going to be on your test. Okay, part of the 3, not part of the 3, in between the 3 and the 30. So kind of like he's the top dude of the 30, but he's not yet one of the 3, even though he's like killing lions on snowy days and doing all of this stuff. That's not enough to get you into the 3. Now, he may have been one of the ones crazy enough to go and get water for David, because again, I think it's part of the 30 that went to did this. Okay, and David put him in charge of his bodyguard. Now, his bodyguard, these are the I forget, the Perathites and Kenites, were not Israelites. Okay, if you remember that. Then among the 30, and then there's just a series of names, and I'm just going to, it starts, among the 30 were Asahel, the brother of Joab. Remember him? Remember Asahel? He was the one that was chasing after Abner, and Abner killed him. And so then Joab killed Abner, and then Joab killed a bunch of people. Yes?
Because you mentioned that his bodyguard were like not Israelites, but they just have been like meat shields then, basically.
They had what?
Would they have just been like meat shields then? Maybe?
Not necessarily. They would have been loyal to the reason for not having Israelites as your bodyguard is that they are not. Their loyalty would be just to David, as opposed to a tribe.
They wouldn't be trying to like claim power from him, basically.
Well, they could. I mean, it would just be anybody could. But the reason for doing that would be, again, their loyalty was strictly to David. Although like most of these are guys from Judah. Most of these towns are located in Judah because this is where his home. These are his people, literally. These are his people. But Asahel is the first of the list of the 30. Elhanan, son of Dodo from Bethlehem. Okay, so there's Bethlehem. And of course, Asahel is David's, let's see, cousin. I've lost track of cousin, uncle, nephew, something like that. Shema the Haradite, Elika the Haradite, Helez the Paltite, Ira, son of Ishkesh from Tekoa. That's the same place that the wise woman was from. Abiezer from Anahoth, Sibbecai the Hushathite, Zalman the Ahahite, Maharai the Netophathite, Haled son of Bana. I did practice reading these. I know you wouldn't know it. Netophathite, Ithay son of Reba from Gibeah in Benjamin. Remember, spent some time in Gibeah, and you can go back and so remember what they said about Saul, that he would go around and when he saw somebody that was great, he would recruit them into his army. I think David did the same thing, and it's just you look through these towns, you think, oh yeah, David was there, and he gets into town, and he sees somebody, he says, hey, come be part of my team. Benaiah the Pirathonite, Hiddai from the ravens of Gash, Abi-Albon the Arbathite, Asmaveth the Barhumite, Eliabah the Shalbonite. I could just skip all of these, but now I'm going to go through and get all these names in. The sons of Jashan, Jonathan, son of Shammai the Hararite, Ahiam, son of Sherar the Hararite, Eliphalite, son of Ahashbai the Machathite, Eliam, son of Ahithophel the Gilonite, Hezro the Carmelite, Perai the Arbite, Igal, son of Nathan from Zobah, the son of Hagri, Zalak the Ammonite, Nahara the Beerothite, the armor bearer of Joab, son of Jerai, Ira the Ithrite, Gareb the Ithrite, and Uriah the Hittite. The last one. So, you know, if you think about this, now think about what Uriah the Hittite is the last one listed there. So think about how David arranged to have Uriah killed. You're going to go up to the wall. If you remember the story, you're going to go up to the wall and then tell everybody to back off. Okay. Now, what was the first guy's name? What happened to let's see, the first one was there. What did Eleazar do? He's up with the crowd. Everyone else backs up. He stays and fights. What does Shammai do? He gets up to the fight. Everybody backs off. He stays. Okay, that's what these guys did. So David knew that if everyone backed off, that Uriah wasn't going to back off. He knew it, kind of thing. So, but it just pointed out that this is who David was dealing with. So again, David is not just, you know, cheating on some strange guy. I mean, this was a very significant person, and one of the reasons why it went, you know, so far south on him. But the list ends with Uriah the Hittite. Okay, so why is this here? Okay, why do we have this list of people? What does this tell us about? What does this tell us about David? What does it tell us about God? Well, the author of Samuel consistently gives God the credit. Okay, and David gives God the credit. Okay, he says it's the utterance of the man exalted by the Most High. Right, that was his first part of his thing. But if you remember back when we talked about in chapter 22, he also gives God credit for training the warriors. In chapter 22, David's Psalm of Praise, verse 35, he says, "He trains my hands for battle. My arms can bend a bow of bronze." So he gives God credit for training it. But the final thing here is David could have taken, and perhaps the writer of Samuel is looking at David could have taken all the credit, or we could just give David all the credit for this and say, you know what, David was just such a great guy. We don't need to go any further than that. But the author says, you know what, there are a lot of other people involved that made David what he was. Okay, David could have taken all of the credit, but he doesn't. Or the author could have just made this a panegyric to David and been done with it. And the author's like, no, there were a lot of other people that were doing some amazing things that kept David in power, that made David who he was. You know, and I mean, you can take a lesson from that and say, okay, we can have great leaders, and great leaders are wonderful to have. You know, it's much more fun to have a great leader to be following than a not so great leader. Okay, or work for a great manager as opposed to somebody who is not a great manager. Okay, sort of thing. So the final message, to me, of this narrative might be that David was a great guy. Okay, he was a great guy, and God certainly blessed him, but he didn't do it alone. David didn't do it alone. Okay, so yeah, there was one of the commentaries was like kind of going on, making an analogy to business managers and things should take a lesson from this. I'm like, okay, let's not over spiritualize the text here, but the fact remains, he didn't do it alone. There were a lot of great people, and kudos to the writer of Samuel, whoever that was, said, you know what, there's some other people we want to. It's just kind of like the thanks at the end of the Oscars. You want to thank all the people involved, kind of thing, sort of thing. Before the music starts playing, we want to make sure all of these other people get a shout out in here. Next week, we'll talk about 2 Samuel 24. The last little two last things that happen in Samuel, and then we're going to have another session after that, where we're going to go into Kings. We're going to be sort of doing the second epilogue, where we kind of go, okay, well, what happened to all these guys? Okay, what happened to all these guys we talked about, and see how it all kind of ends up. Any questions? All right, well, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next week.